Imagine a world without suicide. It is our ambition at Suicide Prevention Australia. We can only achieve this by addressing the causes of distress, which in turn requires a collective effort. We can never underestimate the impact of suicide on family, friends, workplaces, and the broader community. At Suicide Prevention Australia, our members are central to everything we do. We have over 200 members, many of whom are leading organisations in suicide prevention. With their help, we deliver national leadership in suicide prevention. We are influencing policy and advocating for government funding. We are promoting quality improvement to build sector capability and allocating millions of dollars for research. We are dedicated to identifying and responding to gaps in knowledge, policy and practice. Our reach is large. Our voice is strong. We are the national peak body for suicide prevention. Change is possible with your help. Walk with us towards a world without suicide.
Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
A big warm welcome to everyone and a huge thank you for joining us for the Australian Book Lovers podcast. Our mission is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature that spans a whole range of genres to book lovers around the globe, as well as fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. I'm Veronica Strachan, aka V.E. Patton, fantasy, sci-fi, memoir and picture book writer, voracious reader of many genres, and one of your co-founders and hosts for this, our podcast episode number 94. Coming to you from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country.
And I am Darren Kazenko, dystopian science fiction and horror author, avid reader, and one of your co-hosts and co-founders of the Australian Book Lovers, coming to you today, of course, from Gunner country, as always, down on the beautiful coast of South Australia. And yes, Veronica, for what is a very special and might I say very important episode.
Yeah, a really special one. And so rather than give you all our, pre and post stuff and all the bits and pieces, we thought this episode was important enough to just stand alone with an interview. So tell us about your very special guest.
Yeah, most definitely. So I had the very unique honour of talking with Dr. Jessica Revill, who, as you'll hear in this really, really touching interview, it's about a book that she's written called Find Him Among the Living. And of course, the reason this is a special episode, it is to just let people know about World Suicide Prevention Day, which at the time of recording is coming up on the 10th of September. And as you'll hear, there's a very special reason that I had the pleasure and unique privilege of talking with Dr. Jessica Revill, and why her book and her conversation is the centerpiece for this special episode for World Suicide Prevention Day, again on the 10th of September. I'll give you, before we have a chat about the interview, I might just give a brief synopsis once again for the book. So it is called Find Him Among the Living, which you'll find under our biography genres on the website on AustralianBookLovers.com. So any mother would die for their child. She would do anything to take the pain away. In the case of suicide, the mother keeps the pain and loses the child. On July 5th, 2020, Jessica Revill took her son's agony and had to learn to live as an emotional amputee. She couldn't grow her son back. She had to navigate the world without her beautiful, funny, autistic boy. Over the next year, she went on an intense journey of grief, post-traumatic growth, and an investigation of the fractured health system that sees 3,000 people a year die this way. The book is framed by Jessica's daily connection to her son, who continues to guide his mother's prevention work as she finds him among the living. And again, that's Dr. Jessica Revill, PhD, who you are going to hear from very shortly. But yes, a really yeah, it was a difficult conversation for me, and difficult
Yeah.
in the best possible way. And
So we just say to listeners that, please be aware that if this is something that is sensitive to you, we'll have some phone numbers for you to have as a backup, but be aware that there is discussion about suicide. Yeah.
Yes. As I mentioned, it is a difficult topic to discuss, but there is some really fantastic and very important insights that you're going to find in the interview. Some really candid moments where I hope some of you are going to laugh out there as you listen to it, because amongst the I guess the heaviness and the dramatic elements of the conversation, there are some really beautiful and lighthearted and playful moments too. And I think that's a testament to the honesty that Dr. Revill brings and the bravery I guess she shows in what she's willing to talk about and how she's willing to share it. So, but I won't go into too much about the interview because, of course, listeners, you're about to have the honour of hearing that. But I will just mention a little bit about World Suicide Prevention Day. So I'll just take this opportunity to read a paragraph from basically Suicide Prevention Australia, which is suicidepreventionaust.org. So we all have a role to play in preventing suicide. Join us this September as we rally together for World Suicide Prevention Day on Sunday, September the 10th. This powerful day of global observance brings together over 60 countries, uniting us in our shared mission to promote stigma reduction, advocate for policy change, encourage help seeking, and honour the memories of those lost to suicide, those who have survived suicide attempts, and those who bear the weight of grief. This year we are continuing our theme of We All Have a Role to Play, echoing the International Association for Suicide Prevention's overarching theme of creating hope through action. In this spirit, we stand united in our commitment to reduce suicide, empowering individuals with the confidence to take action. In Australia alone, nearly 10 million people have been affected by suicide, which equates to almost half our nation. At Suicide Prevention Australia, we firmly believe that every single person can play a role in preventing suicide, not only on World Suicide Prevention Day, but every day of the year. So together, let's embrace our collective responsibility, champion hope, and take meaningful action to save lives. So that was just a little bit from the website, which is suicidepreventionaust.org, or short for Australia. And again, the Suicide Prevention Day, 10th of September 2023.
Very good.
So you mentioned, Veronica, before we jump into the interview, because it is an important subject, just a few phone numbers I'd like to share with listeners. Hopefully nobody needs to use these phone numbers, and hopefully no one needs to give them to anybody, but should you need them, I think there's a couple of good resources here. And, I know it's a little bit different to our usual episodes, but it's an important subject, and so definitely just want to take this very brief moment and just share with you a few numbers. So the first service is called the Suicide Callback Service. Now that phone number is 1300 659 467, and the Suicide Callback Service is a 24-hour nationwide service that provides telephone and online counselling to people 15 years and over who fit one of the following categories: people who are suicidal, people caring for someone who is suicidal, people bereaved by suicide, health professionals supporting people affected by suicide. So the Suicide Callback Service is especially suited to people who are geographically or emotionally isolated. Once again, that number 1300 659 467. The next one is something that most of us will be familiar with, the next service, and that's Beyond Blue. Their number is 1300 224 636, and Beyond Blue provides information and support to help everyone in Australia achieve their best possible mental health, whatever their age and wherever they live. That number 1300 224 636. There's also a service called Brother to Brother, and that number is 1800 435 799. And Brother to Brother is a 24-hour crisis line that provides phone support for Aboriginal men who need someone to talk to about relationship issues, family violence, parenting, drug and alcohol issues, or who are struggling to cope for other reasons. The line is staffed by Aboriginal men, including elders who have lived experience in the issues that the line offers support for. And that number again, 1800 435 799. Next, the next service is Headspace, which you can call on 1800 650 890. That is a free online and phone support and counselling to people aged 12 to 25, as well as their families and friends, available 9 a.m. to 1 a.m, 7 days a week. That's Australian Eastern Standard Time. Once again, that number is 1-800-650-890. A couple more. There is the Grief Line, which is 1300-845-745, which offers free telephone support, online bereavement support groups and forums, grief resources and information, as well as education and training programs. Those lines are open from 6 a.m, 7 days a week. There's also the Kids Helpline, which is 1-800-551-800, which is a free private and confidential telephone and online counselling service specifically for young people aged between 5 and 25. Once again, that number, 1-800-551-800 or 800, however you prefer to announce it. The lucky last one I'd like to talk about is a service called Q Life, and you can call that on 1-800-184-527 from 3 p.m. to 12 a.m, 7 days a week. Q Life is actually Australia's first nationally orientated counselling and referral service for LGBTI people. The project provides nationwide early intervention, peer-supported telephone and web-based services to diverse people of all ages experiencing poor mental health, psychological distress, social isolation, discrimination, experiences of being misgendered and or other social determinants that impact on their health and well-being. So Q Life can be contacted on 1-800-184-527. So there we have it, listeners. Just a brief rundown of some of the services that are available that I think it's important just to highlight as we're moving towards that pivotal date on September the 10th. Saying that, Veronica, and do you think maybe it's time to go to the interview, because that's what the show's all about?
Indeed, about talking to the authors.
It is indeed. So without further ado, and I have used a cliche, but guilty as charged. But no, it's been an absolute privilege to introduce to everybody Dr. Jessica Revill. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special Australian Book Lovers podcast episode. And here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, my ever so graceful and generous guest for this very special edition, which is in recognition of what is such an important event all around the world, that being World Suicide Prevention Day on the 10th of September, is the author of the brand new release, Find Him Among the Living. She has a master's degree in psychology from California State University, a PhD in educational psychology from UCLA, is a professional psychologist here in Australia, and hosts her own video podcast show called Prisoner of the Mind as part of her unstoppable mission to educate fellow Australians of what can be done to help prevent the heartbreaking tragedy that is suicide. So, Dr. Jessica Revill, welcome to the Australian Book Lovers podcast.
Thank you so much.
It is an amazing opportunity to have a chat with you, and I really do thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with all of our listeners. I mean, it's obviously goes without saying that tonight's many of the themes of tonight's discussion are going to be as difficult as they are important, but no, I really do appreciate you bringing all of your knowledge, your wealth, and your experience to our listeners. So I guess I'll start with a couple of years ago that I saw that you wrote that, and quote, "It is vital that we all examine the spectrum of our own personality, consciousness, and even neuroticism in order to find, as Pablo Neruda said, our place on the porch." So I am wondering if we might start by yourself letting our listeners know a little bit about you, about your journey, and about where your place on the porch might be at this moment in 2023.
Yes, I suppose the place on the porch might change. You might move to different places on the porch, and I suppose now my place on the porch is more in shade. In July 2020, I lost my son Gregory to suicide. He was an autistic man. He was 25. He had had some mental health issues growing into mental illness, let's say. He was born a healthy boy, but when he was about 18 months old, his behaviour started to concern me. He would turn on the tap in the bathroom and watch long columns of water for long periods of time. and he wasn't developing speech normally. He wasn't playing in a congruent way with other children. And after some testing, by the time he was about 4, he was diagnosed with autism. And so followed the interventions, the support systems, the speech therapy, the occupational therapy, all those things that you do. And he grew up and was happy for a time, but maybe even after 12, 13, it seemed like a shadow fell upon him, and he got low, and then he leveled up a bit, and then he'd get low, and then he'd level. It almost became a way of life for us. And by 2018, he was starting to get into such decline that it was difficult to hang on to him. It was difficult to communicate with him at all. And the ending, of course, was the Sunday night when he took his life. And I was told by my husband and daughter who found him.
I'm pretty much speechless there, because it's definitely far from any sort of experience I've had. You mentioned that there was obviously highs and lows, and your son leveled out. Look, in hindsight or at the time, were there any signs that really stood out to you when you look back now that maybe other people might be able to, utilise that hindsight for people out there or listeners out there that are in a situation where they know someone who's not in their brightest place, or know people that know somebody who's not in their brightest place?
I think that's such an apt and such a good question, because it's not what we're usually told in suicide prevention. There's a researcher in the RAND Corporation, Ranjiv Ramchan, and he looked at these so-called signs. There's a belief within suicide prevention that certain signs, such as a lack of interest in things that a person was normally interested in giving things away, a pessimism, will descend upon a person imminently before they die. This is generally not what happens. What you either get is no signs at all, and 80% of people who suicide do not show any signs at all, or people who have a more chronic condition. So my son would get quite low, and we continued to go to therapy. He attended to his psychiatrist, he attended his speech therapist, and so forth. And then his mood would level up, and he'd be a bit more buoyed, and he would go along quite well. He really loved music, and going out to see hardcore music in and around Sydney was a joy for him, and he did that, and that really helped him. But his signs were more chronic, and I think that that's the thing that people don't perhaps understand. With people who are chronically mentally ill, they can be very low, and then they get a bit better. So which low period are you going to leap upon? My son was hospitalized, or he went to Royal Prince Alfred once, and he was scheduled and taken to St Vincent's Hospital once. But yeah, the signs are ever present rather than just appearing shortly before.
Was there, and please let me know if I'm delving into personal territory that maybe you don't want to discuss, but I'm just, I have to ask, I'm very curious, was there anything that had begun at any point where that was there an issue being addressed as far as the possibility that something like this might happen with your son? Or was it a case that it really did sort of come as a surprise, even though there was those elements that you could see that he was sometimes in a good space and sometimes not?
It didn't come as a surprise. You're always shocked when it actually happens, but it didn't come as a surprise to me. There is a twist in the book, in the sense that my husband and I have been separated for a very long time, but we are definitely family and definitely supportive of one another. But my husband was in deep denial, and I was working up in Grafton for a while, and at this time my son was scheduled and taken to St Vincent's with a very big suicidal gesture, and I was never told.
That must be, pretty hard thing to swallow, really.
Yeah, it was. There's been a complication with my grieving, in the sense of great anger, and I would reason it this way. I think that his father loved him so much that he couldn't fathom the idea that this was real. And so he just didn't believe it. The doctors note that the father seems to be minimizing the event.
Well, look, again, I definitely don't come from a position of being in a situation like this at all, but I have been in moments of extreme shock and grief, and absolutely there's, each of us in such different ways try and process, or perhaps even push away that need to process, because the reality can be so harsh sometimes. And I think, denial in the sense of it just doesn't compute is just such a human response, isn't it? And you throw in, love and, fear, and I guess each of us can face these moments in time in such different ways, and there's no rule book, is there? There's no guidebook in the sense of we just don't know how each of us individually is going to face something like this until that moment arrives.
I also think that it speaks to changes that could be made. Unfortunately, the most we know about suicide is what they call postvention, after the fact. You can join the dots in retrospect, but often not before. And in allied health and psychiatry, we tend to treat the individual, not the family system. And I think that, when I took my son initially to get some medication with a specialist psychiatrist, really nice person, I don't want to suggest that any of his practitioners are responsible for his death. I don't want to suggest that at all. The practice of psychology, the practice of psychiatry is done individually. And I think it needs to be standard practice at intake that the family system is present, the father, the mother, the child, possibly a sibling. Because especially with a child with a disability, you are the environment in which the child lives, and therefore you're overseeing the child the whole time. And I think psychiatrists need to not assume that people know everything that they know, and that they need to educate the client and the client's family where the parameters are, especially with something like autism, that risk factors are somewhat different for them. And also try to understand the limits of the family system in front of you. I did not have a sense that my husband was capable of that level of denial. And I think that sort of thing needs to be addressed. And also, what are the parameters of when we escalate? What are the parameters for them? And what are the systems of escalation? This was never discussed either, and it's generally not discussed as a rule unless you're in a suicide prevention specific service. We initially went in for depression. My son had developed Tourette's in adolescence, and I was concerned that he may also be developing psychosis, because there were some periods of time where he was not coherent and he was quite disturbed. So yeah, we've got to look at the entire way that the family system is addressed in a situation like this, because we're all part of the solution, or should be.
I think definitely I'm very interested in chatting with you about, some of the, well, I wouldn't say the failings, but some of the areas of all the facets of the systems that are available to us in Australia, as well as some of the positive aspects and perhaps those areas that are improving. But maybe this is a good opportunity to, turn our headlights straight onto the part of the reason that I have the wonderful opportunity to talk with you this evening, and that is about your book, Find Him Among the Living. Now, I understand that Find Him Among the Living doesn't only discuss, obviously the devastating loss of your son Gregory and the almost impossible, I guess, challenges that came with learning to live, as you mentioned, or as you so eloquently put it, as an emotional amputee. But it's also an investigation into, as you were just sort of alluding to, poor medical training, ill-equipped emergency rooms, ineffective prevention programs, and as you discuss in the book, the bias against the disabled and mentally ill, which fails to save over 3,000 lives a year, which is a horrible statistic. Bearing in mind all of that, when it comes to Find Him Among the Living, When did the actual idea, I'm curious, for the book come about? Because they're, obviously it's been inspired by a very big moment in your life. And when did the courage and strength arrive, that saw you actually start the physical process to write it? How far? Yeah, so I'm curious as to when those two features came together that eventually brought us this book.
When we lost our son, obviously, it's like being hit by a wrecking ball and you're thrown into a flurry of activity, informing other people, arranging, burials, cremations, memorial services, things like that. And so I did all that. And once that was done, I had to make a decision about what his father and his sister and I were going to do. I was down in Sydney with them, and I said to them, I just don't want to be alone right now. My husband was retired, and my daughter she's an artist, and so she could do her work remotely. And it was sort of around COVID. My son died under the first wave of COVID. And so we went back up to Grafton where I was living, and I started to move into another phase of the grief, and I'm what you call an instrumental griever. There's intuitive grievers and instrumental grievers.
Okay.
Instrumental grievers are people who ask questions, do things, try to find out the answers. That's part of the way that they grieve. Intuitive grievers, it's more like you see in the movies, the people who are entirely emotional about this and they fall apart and they can't get out of bed. There's no correct way. Interestingly, it's often men who are instrumental grievers and women who are intuitive grievers. But in my family, I was the instrumental and my husband was the intuitive. He's a very soft-hearted person. And of course, I can't imagine a father loving a son more. So he cried solidly for about 3 weeks. And I did what my grief counsellor described as leaking. I would do things and I would sort of leak in between. And of course, one of the things I did in terms of trying to process my instrumental grief was to start to write. Mm-hmm. And I got myself like a writing coach, a wonderful person called Jan Cornell in Sydney. And I would write a couple of chapters and we would talk on Sunday nights and review what I had written. And then I'd set off to writing more.
I've got no doubt that the book obviously is somewhat of a reflection of the journey that you were taking. And then, of course, by nature, it becomes part of the journey. Did you have a specific, goal in mind for the book when you started writing it? Was it more just something for yourself at that time, or was it, or did you have an idea of the audience? Was it something that you wanted to communicate? Were you already trying to put a roadmap out there for other people, or was that not something you were conscious of at the time, and it was more just a case of, like you said, that activity in between the leaking?
I didn't do it as a project simply for myself. I always thought of publishing the book. Mm-hmm. As I learned more and more about my son's journey, and especially around the emergency room, what could have been done and wasn't done, I really wanted people to know about it. I think it's a book that certainly would be helpful for families who are bereaved in this way. But I also think it would be a book that would be interested to the general public to learn something that they haven't known thus far, and is that I call people with autism the dirt under the fingernails of the lepers in the emergency room. If people who are mentally ill are the lepers in the emergency room, then people who are autistic, can you imagine people with sensory issues going into a loud, bright emergency room with, noise, people shouting, various people coming up to them and speaking at them rapidly, being hauled this way and that, or just having to sit there and wait for 6 to 11 hours, which 11 hours is the average, to see somebody. So it's really almost a toxic environment and could cause as much harm as healing. And I suppose as a proud mother, I wanted to paint a portrait of my son because I'm proud of him and I want everybody to know about him. One of the things about grief and bereavement is we're not very good at it as a society, and a lot of people I now call civilians who haven't had this sort of loss, they can ignore the subject altogether, they can shut down very quickly, they can change the subject, they can try and silver lining your experience, they can do all sorts of things that are not helpful and sort of anti-bereavement. And then there are my comrades in arms, the other suicide bereaved parents who I have interacted with a lot through social media, who understand that need to speak about their child. We post things on Facebook. There are some private Facebooks for suicide bereavement. We post the pictures on their birthdays, on what they call the angelversary, which is the day of their death, or just various aspects of their lives, because we want to keep a relationship with our child. And it's interesting, having met other bereaved parents, I feel like I have a whole lot of posthumous nieces and nephews. I'm very interested to hear about their child. I'm very interested to talk about their child, because it might surprise people, but we're very proud of our children. We don't stop loving them, and we certainly don't stop having a relationship with them after they die. You know, my son is a driver of my actions on a daily basis.
That was a really beautiful thing you said there, where when you said you felt you have posthumous, nieces and nephews, and obviously from the title of the book, Find Him Among the Living, it really hints at that, revelation that although I think 3 years ago, or 2020, that moment in time did arrive, and you did lose your son, and yet you still have that relationship with him, and it's still a part of your everyday life, and probably a huge part of the motivation that drives you forward. And I have no doubt there must have been some pretty difficult moments and challenges, when it came to writing the book. But I am curious as well, were there any unexpected beautiful moments that took you by surprise while you were putting the book together?
I think that writing the book was such a way of keeping him close. It's interesting that when I finished writing the book, I went through, and a lot of people apparently do this, even when it's not a book about a death, they go through a sort of a post-publishing bereavement. They go through it's like postpartum, because I had, connected with him by writing the pages and talking to my writing coach and doing that on a regular basis. And I suppose writing things that express not just devastation. A life has light and shadow. Even a life that ends tragically, it has light and shadow. And finding and communicating the beauty in him and the funny parts, because my son was incredibly funny. When he was well, he was very witty. You think a person with autism wouldn't necessarily understand sarcasm, but autism is a spectrum and everybody kind of gets it differently. He used to just do the most hilarious things, like I remember he was looking at a picture of his sister's christening, and his sister's older than him. And I said to him, she cried throughout the christening. She howled, And he looked at the picture and then he said in a high-pitched voice, "It burns, it burns."
Oh, dear.
It was a she devil.
Touche, yeah, that's a good...
And there was another time when my husband showed up with a keychain, and it was absolutely vile. It was a pencil, an anthropomorphic pencil of this keychain, and the nib of the pencil pointed downwards in a phallic way. It had legs. It had these horrible teeth like a Victorian serial killer and this hideous expression. And I just looked at my husband and I said, "That's Gregory's, isn't it?" It's so him. It's so him. I could just, and the thing is, my son can still make me laugh.
Well, it sounds like he had a good taste in music too, and didn't mind the heavy stuff, and got out there and supported the good live music.
He did. He supported some local bands like Final Frontier, and then, you know, historically we have been to see Avenged Sevenfold, and I'm trying to remember the really old metal band, the English one. What's it called? Famous Iron Maiden.
Oh, don't say they're old. I know they're old, but I grew up with Iron Maiden. I love them dearly. So
Yes, well, they're very
Gregory
good
definitely
old
had good
fellas.
taste.
So yeah, and he had an amazing musical taste. He you know, he figured things out. He figured out Ray Charles and Etta James, and he knew jazz, and, you know, he had a great baritone voice, but he could also do this amazing grit singing. And one of his friends sent a clip to me while I was writing the book, a little video clip of one of the gigs, and the lead singer handed the microphone down to Gregory in the audience, and Gregory got up on stage and he just took over and he finished the song. And he
beautiful.
had this amazing stagecraft. He was, you know how some people might get up on stage and be racked with fear.
I was going to say, just freeze, yeah.
Yeah, freeze and worry about how to perceive, whereas he inhabited the song, and he had his sort of slightly jerky autistic movements worked really well in hardcore. It just fit in. In fact, hardcore is such a great place for neurodivergent people to be if the sound didn't bother him. He loved the sound because they're all weird, generally not sporty types. And Gregory's just accepted as another subtype of weird.
Oh, absolutely. I think that the heavy metal or the hardcore or that sort of, you know, loud and abrasive, but absolute beautiful music. No, there's always those crowds are just full of embrace, you know, and that's one of the beautiful parts about that culture and about that music. And it sounds like he was very much embraced.
He was very much embraced, and it's interesting, there were a lot of people showed up to his memorial service in black, but it's not because they're in mourning, it's just what they normally wear.
Oh, okay. They still had their uniforms on.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Gregory's friends, do you know, have any of them had the chance to read Find Him Among the Living? And have they given any feedback or...
Yeah, look, of his friends, I'm not aware yet. I've had some of my fellow bereaved and, you know, friends from before read it. And happily, I feel they get what my intention was, that they felt entertained by the book. I really wanted that to happen. It's not a diversion, but it's also, it's not entirely doom, because I don't want my son to be defined by his death. His death was terrible and his decline was terrible, and we got into a muddle because there basically isn't a prevention service for autistic people. There isn't a suicide prevention. It doesn't exist. There's an interesting consultant in the United States, Lisa Morgan, who's an autistic woman herself, and she's starting to educate first responders and people in medicine and therapy about dealing with neurodivergent people. But we're very behind, you know, we're very behind. It's almost like, if I could give you an equivalent, I would say it's sort of like having tuberculosis before penicillin.
Wow. One of my questions was always going to be, you know, from a professional standpoint, where you might think some of the what areas within our systems and which systems themselves are possibly failing here in Australia, and you know, and also to balance that out, where from a professional standpoint have you seen some of the biggest improvements? I mean, what sort of, where are some, like, I guess if you were to hone in a little bit for people that might be just entering the system or might just be about to have to start to navigate this kind of, you know, complete chaotic, you know, dark forest where the roads may not take you where you need to be, and especially from someone from your professional position, which is a rare and excellent place to sort of have a look throughout the trees, where do you think some of those systems are failing here in Australia?
Well, I think one overarching kind of cultural problem is ableism, and ableism is the bias against the disabled, and it's an unconscious thing. People who have power don't recognize that they have power.
Okay.
And I say that we live in a world that is neurocolonial. And what I mean by that is it's almost like neurologically we behave like the British colonizing the world, worship our God and wear these itchy clothes. So there's this notion within ableism that there's a right way, and people who are intellectually, cognitively, neurologically different or not able-bodied, that they're somehow incorrect, and that we're sort of reaching down to them benevolently, rather than seeing, disability as a social construct. It's really a social construct where we see one part as normal and one part as exceptional. And so we don't make global adjustments for people with disabilities. I had a friend who was paraplegic, and I couldn't believe in hanging out with this person how difficult it is just to navigate onto public transport, navigate the footpath when there's building works. It's just not thought of. And, sadly, the medical training in Australia, there was a study by Professor Julian Troller at the University of New South Wales, and he studied 14 medical school curricula in Australia, and the mean amount of time that trainee doctors spend on learning about developmental delays and cognitive impairment is 2.55 hours.
Oh, that is a very, very low number.
It's appalling. And so if you're, some new parents and you find out your child has autism, you're probably sitting in front of a practitioner who knows less than you do.
Do you have an opinion or an idea of why that is so low? I mean, I would think surely it's a field, when it comes to medical training, surely it warrants just as much weight and importance as any sort of medical or neurological condition. Why would it be, 2.5 hours or something ridiculous like that?
Very cynically, if you look at where research dollars go, they go into the sort of the sexy illnesses like heart and cancer. You're not seeing, a Elon Musk sponsored, autism study or, psychiatric emergency unit, do you? These are not sexy conditions. And it would be nice to think that people in power were doing it for right and moral reasons and that there was fairness. But there's bias. There's internalized bias in the systems in which we live. So that's very much a problem. I think there's an extreme problem with emergency rooms, and even the Australian College of Emergency Medicine, they've recently put out a study of themselves called Nowhere Left to Go, and they describe the emergency room as an ambulance at the bottom of a cliff.
That's a pretty horrific title, considering the people that published it.
Yeah, well, and I applaud them for not closing ranks and being quite frank and honest about how they're failing. The amount of time that people just, not just neurodivergent people, but people in general who are suicidal, how long they have to wait, that there's a lot of internalized negative attitudes from doctors towards people who have mental illness. And I think it's because it's a very different thing from physical illness. Physical illness is a bit like math. It's more linear, whereas mental illness is a lot more circular, and you don't get the immediate outcomes. And whereas in the emergency room, timeframes are very important, and in fact, their performance indicators are often around, doing things expeditiously. So you want to expeditiously, have a stent in a heart. But with mental illness, you need the opposite. You need time.
From standing on the outside looking in, I've always thought of it, because I have wondered, along similar lines of thought about why there is that sort of unease or that sense of apprehension about dealing with people that are neurologically divergent or, on the spectrum and stuff like that, especially in medical environments. And as again, I'm far from professional or anything like that, but it's from my weird old little perspective from the outside. It's almost as if for most stuff, when you go to emergency centre or emergency room, well, like I said, it's somewhat linear, but also you're dealing with something that's referenceable in a book. Is it A and B, then we need to do C. Is it this, then we need to do that. It's a biological thing. It's a bone thing. It's a physical thing. It doesn't matter who you are. Let's just address the problem that you've got, the broken leg, the torn, whatever it might be. But when it comes to something neurological, to the point where you have to deal with the human being, that throws it in a different shade of light, doesn't it?
Yes, and you have to, these are sort of soft skills that they don't necessarily learn. I say soft skills. Look, there's been amazing advances in suicide prevention methodology from people like Anthony Bassani and David Jobs and Craig Bryant. These are Americans who have worked out better systems. They're not employed in hospitals generally. In prevention services, they are. The SAFE side, which is Professor Anthony Bassani's work, that's applied to a lot of the suicide prevention services in Australia. And it's a more dynamic case formulation and intervention. But it's interesting to me, the suicide prevention services that are funded by our government are looking at mild to moderate cases. And then when they start to escalate, it's called stepping up. Well, if you step up to hospital, they know a lot less. And so what happens in hospitals is that you're simply held, you're fed, and they ask you on a regular basis, do you want to kill yourself? And people eventually figure out, if I say no, they'll let me out. And I'd say the majority of people are not released with a discharge plan or any definite appointment at a prevention service or an intervention, and people are having to wait months for services. Now that's an easily closable gap. Hold on to people until you can assure that they have a stepping stone. And the most risky time for people who have made a suicide attempt or gesture is the first 30 days out of hospital.
Always amazes me, without getting too caught up in politics or anything of that nature, but it always amazes me as a young, what we would probably call ourselves as a young country, with a national population that'll fit into most moderate cities around the world, with the ability to look at all these big cities and countries with populations 10 times ours that have had so far longer to deal with all these issues across a whole range of things. But let's just take the medical field. Why haven't we learned from other mistakes, and why are we running to? How can we be such a small population with the ability to really make a difference and do things different and learn from all these other countries' mistakes and big cities? Not just mistakes, learn from all the good things, the bad things, and really carve a new way. And it just feels, and I have been in the medical system. Had been rushed to a hospital quite a few times over the last few years for reasons that are not pleasant, and been back at hospitals and major surgeries and all that. And it's a really scary place now, because it is just it's on its bare bones.
Yeah, and I unfortunately there is politics in it, and I think successive governments have farmed out a lot of healthcare services to non-government organizations, and the performance indicators are, often around how much are you keeping within the budget. And we need to do things like ask people who completed the service or even didn't complete the service, I think particularly important, as to what their lived experience is of the service, so we can find out what's going well and what isn't. But I think money's a big thing, and if you look at the average, if you went on Seek and you looked at the average hourly rate for counsellors and psychologists who are in suicide prevention, it can be something like $56 an hour.
Which is, today, living in Sydney, that's not going to really get you very far nowadays, is it?
And a brickie's earning more than that, So it's, I think in health there's a lot of check the box going on. We've done this, we've done that. But from the perspective of the consumer, the client, the patient, I'm not sure that that's always true, you know. So I think, yeah, we have a long way to go. I also want to say in defense of Australian mental health, I think we are probably quite good in world terms at mental health, but not mental illness. We closed down most of the kind of institutional hospitals for mental health. There are only about 2,000 odd beds in the entire country, like 24/7 supported hospital beds in the public system for mental health crisis.
Yeah, again, shocking number.
Yeah, and we have only, I think, 2,700 psychiatrists in the whole country, and try finding a bulk billing one. That it's just not enough. I think despite what we did, and we, you know, my son's had interventions and therapy since he was little, and then when he started to decline, I got him on NDIs, and I found some really wonderful, caring people. But I think it's like a Band-Aid for a gaping wound. I think that he, you know, he would have done well in a hospital setting for many months while he learned how to live. And I think also on the way up, a lot of people who have autism, because people with autism are sort of around 8 times more likely to die by suicide than neurotypical people. We're just learning now, and a lot of this stuff I've learned through social media, not necessarily through professional channels, of autistic people talking about the burnout they experience through having things communicated to them in a way that doesn't suit their sensory and their communication needs, how they spend a lot of time masking their true behaviors. I know my son would do that. He would, a lot of autistic people stim. They, you know, you've seen the little kids sometimes, they hand flap, and that's the way they get rid of excess energy and anxiety. And I remember he'd come home from school when he was a teenager, and he'd go in the backyard and he'd just run to the right and run to the left and run to the right and run to the left to get all that energy out. And I know he wasn't doing that at school. He was hiding. It's hard to be, think of it this way. Imagine going to a job interview and you're interviewed by a person with Down syndrome, a person with cerebral palsy, and maybe somebody who is deaf. And the deaf person's signing to you, but you've never learned to sign. The cerebral palsy person is quite difficult just mechanically to understand. The person with Down syndrome is not communicating in a way that is the same sort of procedural way that you would understand. Okay, that would be very confusing, wouldn't it, if you're a neurotypical person? So,
absolutely. But because you'd be out of your comfort zone because suddenly you've got to try and find a way to communicate as well.
Right, and while remaining, culturally congruent and respectful, because you don't have the power, right? So that's the experience of neurodivergent people every day. They're having to overcome input and procedures that don't make sense to the way they're wired. And if you can imagine that setup that I just suggested to you, that's an everyday experience. Do you think by the time you got to 20 years old, you might be exhausted?
I think I'd be exhausted after one day.
Yeah, it's really hard.
To try and take things and put a positive spin, because obviously the journey and the reason for your journey are far from positive, but the journey you've taken, you're now in a position with the book, having written Find Him Among the Living, and from the position you find yourself now, well, this temporary, shall we say, place on the porch, and the experience you've had on your journey, for someone who's about to go through this gauntlet, what's a couple of key pieces of advice that you can give to anybody about to try and navigate that medical system that can give them a bit of an advantage, or maybe prevent them from going down the wrong lane and getting a bit of frustration and heartache? Any hints or tips or tricks to game the system that you've discovered that you might be able to pass on?
It's hard. If we're talking about suicide in general, understand that the system's a bit upside down and you're not actually escalating when you go to a hospital, you're holding. Make sure when you go to hospital, you're not just attended by junior medical officers, as my son was. The psychiatrist did not sign off on him when he departed hospital 8 hours after standing on the edge of a building and threatening to jump. So make sure that there's a there's the consultant is the specialist. That would be the consultant, would be the psychiatrist. The resident is the psychiatrist in training, and the JMO, the junior medical officer, is somebody maybe 2 years out of medical school. So make sure, if you're attending with a loved one, that you get to talk to the consulting psychiatrist. If you don't get an appointment or a discharge, get onto one of the services, go on the internet and look at the primary healthcare network services, the suicide callback service, Beyond Blue has a service. There are some suicide services. It's difficult to get in, but I think that those very specific services are very, very important, because they formulate suicide in a particular way, and they use methodologies that a regular psychologist, regular psychologist might not know. The proper use of the measures to use, the safety plan, the support plan, the case formulation. Just as a note too, what's the service that's for young people? There's a mental health service for young people. The name escapes me. Anyway, there's an app that is suicide prevention app that you can get, and it has a safety plan. Headspace. There's a Headspace. Oh,
of course, yes.
Yeah, there's a Headspace app for a suicide plan, and it's great because it's in your phone, and you can share it with people who can support you in that time of need. So, reducing access to lethal means, things like that. So, if you are the loved one of a person like this, you have to almost, I'd say, give up work until you can chaperone this person into a service. I also think that as a nation, we need to look at mental health preventatively in real terms. We talk about prevention, and there are these sort of drop-in deep breathing courses that are taught in the curriculum at school. I would love to see a mental health curriculum, kindergarten through year 12, that's examined at HSC. We all have a mind. We all have mental health issues. We all have relationships. So there's so much that you could learn at a young age, and to develop habits and understanding to utilize throughout life, that not only would help in suicide prevention, but I think would help reduce domestic violence, would help identify mental health issues before they start getting masked by drug use and so forth. So I would love to see that sort of change. And unfortunately, if you have a child who's neurodivergent and mentally ill, you really are in tremendous difficulty. I mean, they can have their NDIS, they can have a therapist, but when things escalate, there are these, suicide assessments which you can use on neurotypical people, but research, especially research of a woman called Sarah Cassidy, who's at Nottingham University, some of the items on these assessments they don't have any what they call predictive validity with autistic people, because, say, some of the items are future focused, or some of the items require abstract types of thinking. So, we're very much in the dark ages of this, and, you're going to have to press and push and navigate a lot of this stuff for yourself, because sometimes your medical practitioners won't know.
Whole lot there. Some really, really good, tips and definitely some good ideas. And, I think you're right. It would be so important to somehow integrate however it can come about, however it's developed, and whatever parameters it's going to work within, but something that, from, like you said, from kindergarten all the way up, that becomes a part of the way that we approach life on a day-by-day basis. So important.
Yeah.
Of course, speaking of importance, and one of the reasons we're chatting is, of course, for World Suicide Prevention Day, which is coming up on September the 10th. So I'm just wondering, Dr. Revill, if you could ensure one message above all others that would make it through to fellow Australians on that day, what message would you like to see rise above all others?
I think that people can only understand this by allowing themselves to be confronted and lean into the complexity. I think a lot of people want to come up with simple answers. It was this, it was that. And I think a lot of people, when they're reacting to suicide, they want a simple answer because it's so frightening. And they want to believe that it would never happen to them. And I think that when you don't know, don't say, and be open to the fact that people who have lived experience of this may have something very important to contribute to the discourse on suicide prevention.
Absolutely beautiful words. Now, thank you, Dr. Revill, so much for your time this evening. Thank you for the courage to be so honest and to talk about what's obviously not only difficult but challenging, but also to, highlight that it's also, in a way, it's a celebration of your son as well, and it's a relationship that you have with him that continues to this day, that's going to bring so much help to a lot of people moving forward. Your spot on the proverbial porch, you did say it was somewhat in shade, but it is not permanent. It's going to keep moving. What is in store for the rest of 2023 for Dr. Revill?
To keep working in the suicide prevention space and to work on my own podcast, Prisoner of the Mind, and interview people who are on the cutting edge of mental health, mental illness and suicide, who've been very generous with their time and are, like me, interested in getting closer to a solution.
Excellent. Well, that is a very important point. Where can listeners jump on and discover Prisoner of the Mind?
So I have a website, prisonerofthemind.com.au, and the podcast, video podcast, is called Prisoner of the Mind with Dr. Jessica Revill, and it's on YouTube.
And who are some of the guests you've had already?
David Jobs, who is at American Catholic University, who's very involved in what's called the Community Assisted Management of Suicide. That's a suicide prevention program. Craig Wright, he's at the University of Ohio, and he's written a book called Rethinking Suicide, which is just a revolution. He talks about suicide escalation as being sort of three-dimensional. We kind of look at it as one-dimensional, kind of like blood pressure, and sort of case formulations that allow us to capture that sort of dynamic aspect of people and their likelihood of dying by suicide. And, people on sort of the spiritual side, there is a wonderful Catholic priest at the University of San Antonio called Ron Rolheiser, and he wrote a book about suicide and suicide bereavement. And we had a really good discussion about, from a spiritual perspective, how he sees it and how he thinks that God sees it. And I think that could be very comforting to people.
Well, we'll definitely be putting a link for the Prisoner of the Mind video podcast. Now, what about for the book? What's the best place for people to grab a copy of the book?
Kindle, Amazon. I think it's Robertson online and Dymocks online also. So you can buy it online. I always encourage people to get the Kindle because it's cheaper. Books are very expensive in Australia.
Well, this is true, but then so is everything. But some things are worth every penny too, or every cent here in Australia. Dr. Revill, thank you so much. It's been an absolute honour to have a chat with you. A real eye-opener for me. And I think this is a conversation that I hope reaches a lot of people, a lot of listeners. And I really hope will, even if just one person listening out there, it helps somebody with their navigation or helps somebody with identifying signs that might lead to early intervention, or just take anything educational, inspirational away from the conversation that you've been so kind to have with me. I just can't thank you enough. And I just wish you all the very best with your work, with your endeavours, with your mission, and with all of everything you're doing moving forward.
Thank you so much. This is the first chapter of Find Him Among the Living, the book about the life and loss of my son Gregory, an autistic man who died by suicide in 2020. And this is the moment where I learned of his death. It was the beginning of my endings. I had moved from Sydney to a farming town near Grafton almost a year prior. My partner Ross had bought an off-grid farm in 2019. I moved up first while he stayed behind to wind up his business in Sydney. Alone in the farmhouse, I painted walls, fed chickens, commuted into Grafton twice a week to build my psychology practice. I moved up there with my dog. I was full of optimism. Ross said he would soon follow. I waited 2 months, then 3, then 6. At 8 months, the water supply ran out. I was sick of his excuses. I left the farm and moved into a little house in the town of Grafton. I then flew down to Sydney to break up with Ross. He had lived in my Sydney home for nearly a year and was no closer to joining me up in Grafton. Ross was not a bad man, he just didn't love me. Down in Sydney, I set to painting and packing up my little terrace all day and into the evening. I expected Ross home from work later. We needed to have a talk. Exhausted from packing and painting, I took a nap in the early evening and woke at about 9 to do a bit more. It seemed no sooner had I walked downstairs that the doorbell rang. It was odd, I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find my daughter Emily and my estranged husband Chu there. We'd never divorced. They appeared like beggars, crying, hunched, broken. Words engulfed in sobs came out of Chu's mouth. Gregory, I don't know if he was looking over the edge. He slipped. He fell off the balcony. There was a pause. My daughter then delivered the final blow. He didn't make it. My son was dead. My initial feeling was relief. I knew he hadn't fallen. He had jumped. His depression had hovered around him, around all of us, like a spectre. I'd always felt deep in my heart that despite our best efforts, my son would take his life. I didn't know when. I suspected it would be when he was older, perhaps after his father died, unable to cope without his soulmate. The undercurrent of panic I had worried about my son in daily life could now give way to grief. It was here. I had many supporters while I was reeling from the death of my son, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with my Italian friend Elisabetta. She's a Roman, but she lived in Pasadena where my son and daughter were born. And so this is a telephone call I received when I was just walking my dog in the afternoon. This was the magic time when the light played on the landscape, cooling the hills to blue purples under an orange sky. Clouds always seem to make sunsets better. My phone started ringing, a call from Los Angeles, my Italian friend Elisabetta. It was late there, nearly midnight. I wondered what was up. Ciao, Jessica. I wasn't sleeping, I just wanted to check how you are, she said in her lilting Roman accent, looking at the sky, wondering where he is. She paused. I could feel her sink on the other end of the phone. I love the grief that she feels for me. It means so much. I just don't know how you feel. I can't imagine. I'm not feeling most of the time. Then I do. Then I feel numb again. I feel him around, like he's hovering. I told her about the dream and the broken toilet and how nothing made sense. I knew she understood. Her life didn't make sense either. We had met because both our children were autistic and in the same school district in Pasadena, California in the late 1990s. Her daughter, Bianca, now 24, was more severe than Gregory. Although Bianca could speak in both English and Italian, she was not always easy to understand. As Bianca grew into a big, hulking girl with a booming voice, she developed obsessive-compulsive disorder. It was so fierce that she assaulted her mother, Elisabetta, in their home more than once. On one occasion, the police arrived with guns and rubber bullets. They didn't know what was wrong with her, and they didn't seem interested in finding out, such as the police response to the mentally ill. Our kids were often in danger from the very people charged with protecting them. It must be strange, she said. Yes, so many feelings happening all the time. I keep thinking about when they were little, when we could make them happy, and now we can't. I know, she sighed. She was happy when she was small. Now we've changed her medication so much. Before she was just not functioning. She was so medicated. Now she's okay for a few days, then she repeats and repeats phrases like she's stuck in a loop. The other day she texted me 25 times the word spaghetti, spaghetti, spaghetti. I know she can't help it, but this is my life. All day, every day. That was the opposing irony of our lives. My son didn't want to live, and her daughter didn't have a life. Neither did her parents. Elizabeth and her husband Robert, a sanguine Irish Mexican man, were just putting out fires all the time, but there was no progress, not really. The psychiatrists just seemed to be guessing, trial and error, mostly error. I remember when they were happy that we would come to your apartment and swim in your pool, Elizabeth. The kids could stay there all day. The light was sinking, the bright colours on the horizon throwing up their last blazes. Gregory used to be close to me. He was open with me about himself until his depression took over, and then slowly he shut me out. Did I ever tell you the story when he explained to me about sex? No. Okay, so I come home from work and he pops out of his bedroom. He would have been about 13. He goes to me, "You know that thing in my book about wet dreams?" This is a book called What's Happening to Me by Peter Mayle. "And how the white stuff comes out?" And I go, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, there's another way." I go, "Oh, really? What's that?" And he says, "You rub it." And I say, "Well, that was a nice feeling, wasn't it?" And he goes, "Yes, it was like seeing from the inside out." Elizabeth pealed with laughter. "Jessica, oh my God, that's so funny." It's kind of brilliant in its way, seeing from the inside out. A neurotypical person wouldn't say that. It's sort of like a genius lens through which they see the world. He used to say those disarmingly honest things. Then as he got older, he distanced himself. Initially, I was glad because I thought that's what you do as a teenager. You find your place, you find your voice. But slowly the depression took him completely away from me. I didn't know what I thought. I thought maybe he didn't like me. I rationalized that he was close with his dad and that was okay. I broke down a little. My poor child, so far out on the edge. So far he didn't know how to come back. This is when I went through Gregory's possessions, and you're always looking for answers. You're always looking for reasons. And I found his tablet. It had been surrendered to police and then it was returned to us. And I opened it to see what I might find and what it might tell me. I picked up Gregory's now charged tablet and unlocked it using the L-shaped code I'd seen him use before. I looked at his Facebook. I noted that he had changed his settings to friends only with me after I confronted him with his suicide message in 2018. So I was not a friend and I could no longer see what he was posting. He had an app for the King James Bible. I looked at his Google search history. The themes followed a pattern of confirmation bias to die rather than to live. One search led to an article entitled "How to Commit Suicide If You're Afraid to Die." Another was a song by the Vaccines called "No Hope." Then an article, "Why the Self-Absorbed Are Successful." At the time of his death drawing nearer, he searched out how to buy a gun. If we had still lived in America, he could have done that easily. I had to find my second wind. I came up for air and after a pause, dived back in looking at his photos and videos. There were pictures dating back to his high school days, happier times with friends, a lovely picture of him standing beside a pretty girl at his high school formal. He had taken videos of himself in the old house in Petersham, rehearsing his thrashing dance moves for hardcore music gigs. It gave me a spike of joy and relief to see how good he was. Excellent moves. He was focused, perfecting something he truly enjoyed. I felt proud. The last videos were a series of dimly lit footage of himself talking to the camera. There are about 6 of them in which he was rehearsing a message of hope. if not for himself, for others who might be contemplating suicide. These are his words. Hi everyone, I feel good today, but I know how you feel, what you go through. I just want to say something. You're special. You mean something to me. Then there's undetectable, muffled words in between. So what if your experiences are messed up? I don't care. How many of you have gone as far as you want to? Maybe you're already happy, but I feel something. I just want to say that in my own way, you're special to me. You're very, very special. So please don't harm yourself. Don't feel like you have to do this. I guess I don't know what it is. Like I said, you're special. One thing I would say about my son is that amongst all his delightful qualities, and when he was well, he was the most funny, engaged, theatrical young man. He often said to me that he wanted to help people. And he missed that opportunity because he got so ill. So I will carry on that legacy for him. I looked through his possessions after he died, and I saw that he'd recorded a message on his tablet, and I believe this message was left behind for other people who were struggling as he did. And he said, I don't care what your background is, I don't care if you're rich or poor, I want you to know that you matter. And this is the way that I sign off my podcast every time. I want you to know that you matter. These are his words, and I will carry them forward for him. I think about him every day. I connect through memories. I connect through even going to the supermarket and seeing what foods that he would have liked me to buy for him. And I have some recordings of him singing. He had a beautiful voice. And I really, above all others, enjoy this one by my son, Gregory Chu, my man, singing Your Man.
Well, baby, lock them doors and turn the lights down low. Put some music on it soft and slow. And baby, we ain't got no place to go. Oh, I hope you understand. I've been thinking about this all day long. Never had a feeling quite strong. I can't believe how much this turns me on. Just to be your man.
Let's meet again. Where magic happens.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families.